Hello, survivors. Welcome to the State of Decay 2 stream. I'm your host, Geoffrey, and today we're going to be talking about user research, how we find out what you think about our game. Now, I am not an expert in listening to people, which is something that anyone who knows me personally will tell you, but that means I needed to bring in an actual professional. This is Jonathan Ehrich. He is our in-house Xbox researcher, and he really knows what he's talking about. How are you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
So for the audience at home, what is an Xbox researcher? That kind of actually sounds like a dream job. Can you tell them like what you do, both on our team or just in general?
You're not wrong. It is a dream job. Xbox Research is a team of user researchers that, oddly enough, works with Xbox. So one of the big things we do is every studio, every game that folks are working on that's first party, that's being worked on by studios like Undead or other studios like 343 or Compulsion, or titles that we're publishing. Those groups all have some amount of a user researcher attached to them. So Undead gets about a third of me. Fortunately, you get the top third, which is the best third.
Oh, yeah, excellent.
And then the publishing team gets about a middle third, and then the rest of my time is spent working on a million side projects and various busy work. And then we work with teams. We also work with other teams like xCloud and Game Pass. We're working on games and products throughout the entire development cycle from the very beginning. When there's like a little twinkle in someone's eye about what a game could be, we're there to tell them why it's a terrible idea, why the audience would never like it. As the game gets through in development, we're there to tell them like what things are working, what things are not, by working with real participants. That's, in the long ago before times, we would bring them into our labs. Now we'll often run remote studies with them. And then for games like State of Decay 2, after they've shipped, we're there to help them understand how the audience is engaging with the game, what the audience thinks about the game, what's working, what isn't, so to help teams prioritize what they can do to make the games even better than they already are.
So before there's a game and before there's an audience, you still will gather like prospective audience members, people who are representative of the audience, to find out what they're looking for and how they react to the ideas, and you take that all the way through to the point where there actually is an audience and you know who's playing the game, and then you can talk to those people. Like you're there for the entire process from beginning to end.
Exactly.
So if somebody actually wanted to get into this field, like what does it take? Like what did you have to do to get to the point where you could be an Xbox researcher?
One of the things I really like about my team is we have folks with a lot of different backgrounds. So there are sort of standard paths into UR. I honestly 100% know what that's like because I'm not one of them. But people who get degrees in or certifications and things like human factors or what is it? Human computer interface is probably my favorite title for a degree that brings people into the field.
Nice.
But a lot of us have backgrounds in academic psychology or neuroscience. So, I'm very, very hard in the weird background of the side of the team. I have a bachelor's and a PhD in neuroscience, did my dissertation at the University of Washington in a lab where I did brain surgery on mice. And
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
In a lab where we were studying how stress interacts with drug addiction and depression, and how neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and dynorphin are involved in that.
Right. So when the audience fills out surveys and is like giving us feedback when they're participating in the public test realm, that stuff is being analyzed by somebody with a PhD who has actually done brain surgery. So this is not just like a bunch of like idiots who make video games reading a bunch of survey questions. Like we've got real professionals working in this field.
We've got real professional idiots reading the survey questions. Exactly.
Well, okay, so that is Jonathan. He's actually not the only person that we've got here today. Actually, this is kind of a special show because we have not one, but two Erics in the house. This is a double-barreled Ehrich extravaganza. Hello, Ehrich Anderson.
Hello, how's it going?
It's going pretty good.
Good to be back.
Yeah, so Erich's been on here before. If you watch our stream, you've probably met him. He's the associate product director on State of Decay 2. He's basically doing a lot of the work that I used to do when I was on the State of Decay 2 team, including listening to feedback and deciding what to do about it. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Ehrich is in the job that he's in, is because since, when he was a full-time engineer, he's always done things like go to Reddit and trawl through it and try to listen to a bunch of player feedback and use that to inform his work, which that's more than I was doing when I was in that job. So kudos to you, Ehrich.
Yeah, Reddit and a lot of the Steam reviews and stuff like that. A lot of Metacritic reviews, user reviews, stuff like that. I like to live in that stuff and see what people are saying about the game.
Yeah, so that is why I've got Jonathan and Ehrich here as our guests. Jonathan as the very experienced researcher who actually who really understands how how to understand and solicit user feedback, and then Ehrich, who's on the development side, who has paid attention to user feedback for a long time in his career and is on the side of deciding what to do about it. So, before we actually get into the meat of the subject matter, there's actually a couple of other burning questions I wanted to answer that are kind of a follow-up from our previous stream. So since the last stream that I hosted, I've been receiving a couple of burning questions from people in social media that I wanted to address here on this stream. The first one is, why didn't Forever Communities come to the PTR in May like you said, you liar? So I should address this because last time I was hosting the stream, that was when we were issuing our public roadmap, where we were sort of talking about when we were expecting certain updates to come out, in what context, that sort of thing. And I, threw some stakes in the ground and said, okay, for one thing, the Forever Communities update, update 30, the next one that we're anticipating, that's going to arrive in May. I said that at the beginning of May, and then a month passed, it became May 30th, May 31st, June 1st, and it still hadn't come out yet. And so some folks started asking me why. And it's pretty straightforward. It actually has to do with listening to user feedback. So I've got this personal YouTube channel that I run where I play and comment on video games, including my own. One of my State of Decay 2 videos had a comment from somebody named John Sopkak, who brought up the fact that apparently people were losing their legacy characters in the live game. And he wasn't sure exactly what the circumstances were, but he was kind of upset about it, even a little bit rude about it, but we look past the rudeness and we take the feedback. And so I brought that feedback to the team, and it turns out there actually was a couple of serious bugs that had not quite bubbled up to us yet from the support site, that with people losing their legacy characters. It was possible if you were hot swapping your account while playing the game, that basically a blank version of your legacy pool could get saved over your legacy pool and delete all of your characters, which is a disaster. It's not common for people to do that kind of hot swapping, so it was a little bit rare, but if it happened, it was really, really bad. And there was also a situation where if one of our earliest updates to the game made it so that if you started a new community with legacy survivors in it and then deleted that community later, we would keep the legacy survivors in the legacy pool so you wouldn't lose them. Players got very used to that over the past several years, and that broke. And so people were starting new communities with legacy survivors, deleting them, and losing the legacy survivors, which was probably, it's not as bad as losing your entire legacy pool, but it's bad, and it was happening probably more often. And so basically, we dropped everything to address those bugs. And so the programmers on the team, they spent some time doing research, finding solutions, fixing them, and then we went through the process of making it ready for an update. And we actually snuck in an unnumbered hotfix about a week ago into the game to stop those bugs from happening. But that takes time. State of Decay 2 has a very small team, and so if you take several programmers to solve bugs for a little while, that means that we're not going to hit our other dates. And so, unfortunately, because we were listening to the feedback and because we were solving some pretty important bugs, we had to delay Forever Communities coming to the public test realm. So sorry about that, but hopefully, it kind of makes sense that we made the choices that we made. And actually, that kind of leads into the other subject, the other question I was going to come up with, as we're talking about the fact that we're a small team, the fact that it takes time to get an update live on the Xbox. And that is, why is the public test realm only on Steam and not on the Xbox, you disgusting toad? So I've been getting this question a lot too. So this is basically, so the public test realm, it's sort of an alternate version of the game that includes unfinished work that we've done, that we've put out in front of the audience so that we can have them play test it for us. And usually we'll prompt them with surveys to let them give us feedback so we can understand how this game is working in the wild, so that we can sort of, do our best work with it and shine it up and make it its best self before we put it out to the entire audience. And Steam is really great because it offers this really slick way for us to do it that we were actually already using for smaller scale closed beta tests. And it was really nice because as a very small team, we could very easily sort of push out new versions of the game into this alternate beta branch on Steam that people could then immediately get and give us feedback and try things out, and it was awesome. The challenge with putting that on the Xbox is that on any console, you'll find that there's actually a longer process, a more complicated process of getting any build out to players, and that's on purpose. Microsoft, which owns the Xbox, Nintendo, Sony, they have a really vested interest in making sure that all the software on their platforms is super high quality and that no one ever runs into some kind of weird thing like you would. Most PC services are a little bit more flexible. They expect there to be modders, people doing all kinds of crazy stuff. The standards are a little different, but on a console, the console manufacturers are really, really concerned with making sure that only good stuff goes out there, which means there's a process to putting a build in front of players. And unfortunately, as you saw with the Forever communities being delayed in the PTR, going through a process like that actually can take a small team a lot of time and can really slow us down. And so that's the reason why, we went with the Steam option, because we can easily push these builds out really quickly, and why it's a little bit harder for us to do that on the console. And actually trying to do it on the console would take so much of our time, it turns out, that it would eat up a lot of the benefits that we get from doing this quick turnaround on Steam. So we're probably not going to be able to do it. Early on, we were a little bit bullish about the chances of doing this kind of thing all over the place. We were very excited about it, but actually, we're probably not going to be able to do it on the Xbox because it would just take so much time away from our agility, from our turnaround. We really wouldn't be able to get a lot of the benefits out of this process that we could normally get. So sorry about that. But luckily, all of the things that we test out in the public test realm on Steam do eventually come to all the players on the Xbox. And the people who are playing on the Xbox, you know what you get? The best versions of those features, where the garbage version of it has already been tested out for you by somebody else. But that actually reminds me, even though we don't have as many options for testing the game early on the Xbox, we are actually working, or actually I shouldn't say we, Jonathan's team at Xbox Research is working on ways for people in general to be able to give more feedback on Xbox games. And I wonder if you wanted to pitch that real quick, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, especially when we're working on games that are in development, we do a lot of research where we will engage with real players in the wild. We'll recruit them. Before the pandemic, we would bring them into the lab and have them play the game and collect data from them, collect feedback that way. On the glass is half full side of coming out of a global pandemic, one of the things we've gotten really good at over the past few years is running remote versions of our study, where we can have people play versions of the game and talk to them over Discord or over Skype. Collect the same sort of feedback and data that we would historically have to do in our own physical lab environment. And so we've been getting ready to sort of widely expand the audience of people we can bring in for games, because no longer having to be in our lab also means they no longer have to be in Seattle. And so we're getting ready to start setting up a database of people across the US to start who are interested in participating in Xbox research studies, which often involves coming in, giving feedback on different games that are in development across the different studios, sometimes doing other stuff for looking at material from those games. Like we were talking about before, there even is a software version of the game. We're still trying to collect feedback on different things that developers want to do or thinking about doing. And so we've got a website up, which eventually will have a link to another website where you can fill out your contact information, talk to us a little about who you are, types of games you want to play. And then people who work with our team can use that information to figure out what types of studies they might want to try and recruit you for. So as I mentioned, that survey link isn't up yet. because we're still trying to like dot some I's and cross some T's and all that. But I'm told that the link should be coming up any day now. So I'm hoping within, maybe within a week or two, you can just find that tab and the giant row on top of Chrome and hit refresh, and then you'll be able to sign up.
So yeah, so this URL that I just put up on the screen, right now it leads to kind of a placeholder page that doesn't have a link to what Jonathan is talking about. I'm going to ask the moderators to put this link in the chat though, so people can follow it. And also, once we put the VODs of this stream up live on YouTube and Twitch, we'll put it in the description below so you can click there. So if you're watching this immediately, or if you're watching it live, there's not a lot there. But if you want to bookmark it and check back in a little while, you will have an opportunity to sign up to be a part of this research stuff, which sounds like it could be a really amazing opportunity to have your voice heard by Xbox Research. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for introducing that. So we should actually try to get into the meat of what we're talking about here. So let me pop into gameplay and get started. So real quick, let me have a look at what I'm doing. So what we're going to be doing, because we're, streaming on Twitch, people kind of expect to see a video game when they come to a Twitch stream. And so I'm going to be running around in the world, probably fighting some infestations, doing some of that nonsense in the background while we discuss research. And so I just wanted to make sure that I know what I'm doing here and that I'm getting on the road. And so back in the day, back when we used to actually do these streams from a studio at the office, I would have somebody else playing the game while I ran around and while I interviewed the guests. But because we're doing this from my home, I have to be the one playing the game and the one interviewing the guests. So we're going to do our best. Hopefully this works. And hopefully we don't get too distracted by the fact that I'm just running around and fighting people. Actually, I was going to switch characters because my current character is very tired. While I'm doing that, why don't I kick off our little discussion here by asking Jonathan a question. So actually, I should actually start. In case somebody came in late, I should introduce the guests that I've got here on the stream. So I'm here with Jonathan Ehrich and Eric Anderson. Jonathan Ehrich is an Xbox researcher. He is basically the person we go to if we want to know what our audience is thinking about our game. Eric Anderson is our associate product director. He's actually one of the main people who makes decisions about how we respond to user feedback. Once we've gotten the feedback, what do we do about it in the game? So Jonathan, kicking us off here, so when is the right time to use a survey in particular to get answers from the audience, as opposed to the other options we have, like reading telemetry data or, doing an internal playtest with just people at the lab?
Yeah, a lot of that kind of boils down to like two things, I guess. One of them is, a combination of sort of like where a game is in development or how much time we want to be spending on things. It's not that once a game is launched, we stop caring, but when a game is in development, it just needs so much attention that's where a lot of our time gets focused. And then the other half of it is just like what the team actually wants to know, right? So a lot of the time, if a team wants to know, like, especially early in development, there will just be basic questions like, can someone play this game? Who cares if it's fun or not? Just like, are they physically capable of doing it? Can they figure out how our inventory works? Can they figure out how our incredibly complicated control scheme works with like 5 different types of attacks, some of which require pressing 3 buttons at the same time, right? And so for studies like that, for questions like that, we'll often do what we call a usability study, where a user researcher will work with someone one-on-one, and I'll bring them into the lab or meet them over Discord. I'll have them play the game, and I'll come up with some specific tasks I might want them to do, and I'll just watch them play the game and be like, okay, now can you go destroy a play card? If we were doing something for State of Decay. And then sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes either way, I still get to sit there and go like, sure, they figured out how to do it, but they couldn't use a grenade to do it because they couldn't figure out how to throw a grenade or something like that, right? And so I guess that's that. Another thing we'll do is often with games in development is we'll bring larger groups of people in and we'll have them play a little less handheld. Once we're a little more confident people can figure out how to play the game on their own. We might have them play the game for a couple hours, and then that's a point at which we would have them do a survey in that sort of more controlled lab environment or moderated remote environment, and be able to say like, how fun is this game? You know, what do you think about the pacing of this game over those couple hours? Did you feel like, does the story make sense? And then with a game that's, you know, especially with a game like State of Decay 2 that's already out, the fact that you have this PTR unlocks a lot of opportunities for us, because that makes it a lot easier for us to get into a situation where we can say like, well, we know people know how to play State of Decay 2 because they're already doing it. We know there's a lot of people who enjoy playing State of Decay 2 because they're already doing that. Now we want to look at like these specific changes that the team wants to make. And so when those changes are sort of earlier on, a little more janky, that might be a point where we're like, okay, we don't want to make like our fans play this because we want our fans to like us. So we'll make people who work in the studio play it instead, because we don't care if they like us. They have to do a job. So that's when we might run like internal studio play tests, and we'll give some early feedback to that, and they'll be able to say like, oh, here's something I think people will really love. Here's something I think people will really hate. And we can do like some first pass feedback on that. And then once we've had a chance to get a little more iteration and polish in, then we might be a point at which we want to put it out in the public test realm. And then we can say like, hey, this is going to be on here for a couple of weeks, right? We don't, especially again, for a game like State of Decay 2, like most changes, sure, someone can play with them for an hour or two, but that doesn't really tell you anything about how it really affects the game, because so much of this game is deeper, longer gameplay than that. And so being able to give people a couple weeks, several weeks to be able to play the game before they might fill out a survey for us can be so rewarding, because then we can really understand how it's impacting the meta and the real gameplay of the game.
So, Ehrich, how do you actually figure out what questions need to be answered about a particular feature that you're working on? Like, you know, how do you work that out?
I want to do a quick note on the previous thing, also because I think there's some insight from our side of things as well about when we want to have a survey around stuff. It often depends on the feature and the kind of the complexity of the feature, and kind of how many moving pieces there are and how much uncertainty there is about how things will play out. For example, something like the Forever communities is kind of a more solid, like scoped piece of work, essentially, where we kind of know the limit of its impact, and there's a lot of smaller questions around that, like in terms of like UX and stuff like that, and a lot of stuff that we can kind of answer internally that, you know, we're like, okay, we can play with that and kind of get the kind of feedback we need. But then there's bigger changes that affect a lot of different systems that can have a lot of emergent, outcomes that, we won't know about until it really gets in the hands of a lot of people. That's like when we really are like, okay, this is really complex and we're going to need player feedback. Like that's kind of one of the things we also look at when deciding what we want feedback on. Also, when it's especially qualitative feedback, we want like, is this fun? Like there's usability is definitely something like we can kind of look at and be like, this is just confusing how this works. And internally we can do that kind of feedback. But when just in terms of just saying, is this fun? Is this engaging? Like that is definitely when you want to turn to the fans. And that's typically when we are very unsure about that part of it. That's when we turn to something like a survey in the PTR. In terms of your other question,
it was really relevant to what you just said. You could have used that as your answer.
But in terms of like figuring out what questions we actually ask, largely, I mean, a good baseline to start from for us is when we are going into a feature, we have a set of goals in mind, like things that we're trying to accomplish with the feature. And so that's kind of that's always a good place to start from. It's like, okay, what are the goals that we have with this feature? And then, basically ask questions around those to make sure we're actually achieving the goals that we set out to achieve. So just turning those goals into kind of questions, and, whatever nuance we need around that. Sometimes it really depends too, if we have specific things about like the implementations, the kind of the solution that we actually used if we have certain uncertainties about certain parts of it, where we're like, we're not sure if this part's going to be confusing or not. We might have specific questions around that. And often, like when we have like multiple rounds of like PTR or feedback, and a lot of it's comes from like the we're addressing things from, say, a previous survey. So previous rounds of feedback, we'll get, if some problems come up, we try to address it. And so now we'll have some new kind of questions like, okay, did we actually address those problems? So a lot of times previous feedback can drive the questions, where we're trying to just make sure that we actually, solve the problems we are trying to solve in this new round of changes. So yeah, it really depends. But a lot of times just what uncertainties we have about, the approach we took, because again, things change when they're in the hands of a lot of people. Like, we play it and we understand the systems and everything. So it's very different when we play it. And so there's just a certain set of uncertainties. Like, well, what does this actually feel like for people who don't know the systems because they didn't help develop them and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's really hard to separate what you know from what the player knows. When you're trying to judge your own work, it's impossible to really be like somebody who completely doesn't understand the feature and has to learn it from scratch. You always know a little bit too much to be able to be useful to yourself unless you go to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think using your kind of goals as a baseline is a good place to start, because then it's just like, are we achieving this thing we set out to achieve? And then giving them some room to kind of give some more nuance there is always great, I think.
Yeah,
So I always like the open-ended kind of questions, where instead of just rating something, like get a little more of a description. Like, those I really enjoy because it lets people elaborate a lot on that stuff, where it's like, okay, not only are we achieving this goal, but like, in what ways are we failing? Because that's also a huge part of it. It's like, if you find, okay, we're not achieving this goal, but how come? Like, what parts are failing? Like,
Yeah.
that's a hard thing to suss out. So, and a lot of times that'll be how we also determine new questions. Is like, a problem will come up, and then we're not sure of the answer. We're like, okay, so people are having a problem with this area of the game, but we're not sure specifically what problems there are within there that's causing them to feel this way. And so then we'll have more nuanced questions we'll want answered, so we can have further understanding of a previous question. So it kind of snowballs into future kind of surveys.
Yeah, so it kind of, it kind of underscores the fact that, there's a lot of, when you're making suggestions for a game, a lot of the time, it's just, well, I think this would be neat. This sounds like a neat, fun experience. And when we're having ideas for the game, sometimes it's just, for us, it's also like, oh yeah, I think this would be neat. But that's not enough. It's like when you're talking about defining your goals, you have to have a much more coherent sense of like, oh no, this is actually what this feature will accomplish meaningfully in the game, or this is what we intend for it to accomplish, so that we can then judge if we're doing it right. Because if we just go in thinking, oh, this will be neat, then we don't even know what survey questions to ask at that point. Because like, is it neat would be the only survey question, and we wouldn't really learn anything meaningful.
It's really easy to focus on what's neat as opposed to a goal. It's easy to get sidetracked a lot with shiny things. We're creative people in general. I think we see shiny things and we go for it. So you definitely need some kind of process to keep you focused on what you're actually trying to achieve.
So Ehrich bringing up all these sort of different kinds of questions we might want to ask actually kind of raises another question that I've got for Jonathan, which is how do you know if a survey is too long? Like, is it possible to ask so many questions that you're getting diminishing returns? Like, talk about like the length of a survey.
Oh, yeah. It is 100% possible for a survey to be too long. The appropriate length of a survey, honestly, is as short as you can get away with. So team, whenever we're planning out a survey, we talk with the team about what questions they have, what they want to figure out. And one, teams always have more questions than we will have room to answer. Two, we always, on the UR side, always want to dive more into understanding the answer to those questions than anyone is actually reasonably willing to spend at their keyboard or filling out a survey on their phone. And so we try and figure out, what the priorities are, what are the most important questions, and then just kind of aim for a perfect length of as few questions as we can ask while answering the most important questions and actually being confident in what we get.
I imagine that like knowing the goals, like Ehrich was talking about, is probably really key to sort of figuring out which questions are the high priority questions to ask and which ones are just like, anytime somebody asks me, oh hey, do you have any questions for the audience about this? I'll always be like, yeah, I have 900 questions about what the audience is asking. But like, yeah, so I imagine that what Erich's talking about, like really being focused on what goals you have, what you're trying to accomplish, can probably help you narrow that down.
Exactly. I think the most important questions are always those that align with the most important goals, and the goals in general. And then what are the things that we can ask that make sure that that feedback is actionable, right? So when we are looking at an update, we could easily just ask like a list of questions like, here's 5 new features in this update. Is it better or worse? Is it a clear upgrade, yes or no? And then we can come back to the team and be like, 80% of people don't like this feature, and they'll be like, why? And I'll be like, oh, guess I should have asked them about that, huh?
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's kind of pressures pushing either direction, wanting the survey to be longer and shorter, and you got to find that like perfect balance point, which I imagine experience probably just helps you figure out like where that balance point is.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I'm not going to be able to name anything off the top of my head, but there are definitely like sorts of questions that when I'm starting to work on a survey, I'm just like, I could ask this now, but I won't, because I know I will get a completely useless answer from every single person.
I think your comment about making sure they're questions that are actionable, I think that's a great one, because that's something like we've talked, like sometimes like we, open source to the team, like what kind of questions we want to ask, and the team will come up with a ton of questions. And I think something you and specifically are really good about doing is like, well, how would you actually act upon that? Like with that data, what would you do? And there's a lot of questions where like, you know what? I don't know what we would do. It's interesting to know, but we wouldn't be able to do anything with it. And so if you can't really do anything with the answer, then that's a pretty good indication that it should probably be cut.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
We can all be intensely curious about what would happen if State of Decay 2 involved, oh God, what's the most absurd thing I can think of? Aliens coming from the planet Earth and rescuing them from the zombies and becoming a PvP game.
Something that we are not saying we're going to do, audience.
Because it sounds fascinating. I don't know that anybody's going to actually then go, oh, people love that idea. Let's do that right now.
Yeah. So before we move on to sort of questions about interpreting the data, we've actually got some questions coming from the audience about that. So we'll want to move on to that subject real quick. I have one more question about sort of like the initial setup of a survey, which is how do you get a representative sample of an audience? Like, how do you know either, how do you make sure you get, the right people answering the survey? Or if you can't, get a completely representative sample of audience members, how do you compensate for that? So I guess we'll start with the first question. Like, how do you try to achieve a representative sample of audience members and get like the right people answering the questions that really will inform us for the audience?
So it'll work slightly differently in different contexts. So if I'm running a study remotely or in the lab, one of the first conversations I have with teams at the beginning of development of a product is like, who's going to want to play this game, right? Like, ultimately, one of the reasons that we know a game is a good idea is that people will want to play it. Because if people won't want to buy the game, if they won't want to play it on Game Pass, then kind of what's the point? And one of the ways we often sort of turn that audience definition to something that's easy to understand is having conversations about games that they think are likely to be competitors, or games that might be really good examples of comparisons for specific features or ideas that the game is working with. And so when I'm recruiting people for a lab study, the most simple thing I might do is just use that list to sort of define a genre for the game, right? Like State of Decay 2, I could say it's an action-adventure game, but that's not quite right. And that's going to get me a lot of people who aren't going to be interested in this game. And so instead, I can put together a list of different games that sort of encapsulate different aspects of the experience we want to be able to pay attention to and be like, okay, I need to find some people who play this game and that game and the other game.
Wait, so you use references to other games to sort of figure, okay, I'm going to go talk to it. I'm going to go find and talk to the audience of this game, and that will tell me useful information about the audience of this perspective game.
Yeah, and the hardest part of that I have found is there is always one game on the list that is more popular than every other game. And so it'll be like, okay, we're making this game with like some stealth elements and some platforming elements. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I'll put Assassin's Creed on the list. And then I'll go into the lab and be like, got a lot of people who play Assassin's Creed today and not people who play any other type of game I want to cover.
That makes
And so
sense.
trying to make sure to balance that, or like talk to the people in recruitment about being like, okay, we want some people who play Assassin's Creed, but not too many.
So one of the major, groups of people that we go to run these surveys is people who play in our public test realm, which is, that's kind of a very specific audience. And I wonder, is there a difference between the audience of the public test realm compared with the broader audience of the game? And like, how do we, if we're getting most of our feedback from that subset of the audience, how do we think that translates into, making decisions about the entire audience of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that boils down to the grain of salt, as it were. Mm-hmm. So, we know that people who play in the public test realm are kind of by definition, they're more passionate about State of Decay than other people who are playing the game, right? There's people who, are fans of the game, enjoy the game, but are playing the game like, maybe a couple hours a month at most, or they'll play it like once a year. They'll be like, oh, I'm going to play through this again because I really enjoyed it. Those sorts of people probably aren't signing up for the public test realm. Or if they are, there's just not going to be as many of them as the people who are incredibly hardcore about the game, incredibly excited about the game, are playing it all the time, want to make sure that they have that chance to give feedback about the game. And, I think the most obvious area where you might see a difference between these groups is difficulty. Anytime we run a survey in the public test realm, we're asking, what difficulty mode are you playing? And there will be one person who plays in green, like 3 people, 5 people who are playing in standard. And then it's like, oh, we got a lot of people doing Nightmare and Lethal over here, huh?
I think that's something, like when we talk about this stuff, I think Jonathan and his team will they'll kind of show us the audience breakdown from the PTR compared to the release game. And so seeing like how much heavily it swings, towards the harder difficulties like Lethal and Nightmare, and then seeing the baseline, like with the live version of the game, how many more people, like how basically most people are playing standard and green. So just seeing the visuals of like the graph breakdown, it gives you a good mental picture of, how different the audiences are. And then that's just something you have to keep in mind when looking at, especially questions around those things like difficulty. If it's something that's kind of could be construed with difficulty, then you have to kind of just know ahead of time that those are going to be heavily biased in the PTR towards harder difficulties, which can be really useful because sometimes, like, if you have a question that is kind of around difficulty, and if the PTR is saying it's too hard, then it's probably really too hard.
Yeah.
So like you just take that into consideration when looking at the different questions. Sometimes some questions probably don't really overlap with difficulty that much. And so it's probably pretty representative because it doesn't, it kind of applies to everyone equally, but it just depends on the questions, I think. But like Jonathan said, keeping kind of a grain of salt about what is said and knowing who the specific audience is and how they compare to the larger audience. That's just something we have to do for everything we look at to be like, okay, yeah, they say it's too easy, but also consider these are the people who like it really, really hard. So how strong of a feeling that is that? Like if they think it's like everyone says it's way, way, way too easy, then maybe it is a little too easy. If they're like, it's just about right, then it might be a little too hard, actually. So it's just something we have to consider, just knowing the differences in the audience.
Yeah. And then another piece of that is because the PTR, or folks filling out PTR surveys, are kind of the most passionate about the game. We want to make sure that we can convince them that that we want them to say mean things about the game. Because it's really easy to get feedback that's like, oh, this game is perfect, or oh, this game is perfect except for this one thing that I've been asking for 4 years now. Geoffrey, what the heck?
I got a few people where that's basically my main interaction with them is, how come you haven't done the one thing I care about yet?
Exactly. But a lot of the time it can, when you're giving someone a new feature, it's like you're giving them a piece of candy. And they're like, oh, I love candy. And what we really need them to say is like, yeah, but is the amount of salt on that chocolate just right? Could there be more salt? No, seriously, is there enough salt? Okay, let me just dump a bunch of salt on. Is it too salty now? Okay, good. That's what we needed to hear. We'll dial it back.
Well, that actually kind of, the answers to that question really kind of lead us into the next topic we were going to hit, which is, how we interpret feedback. So as we're getting into the discussion of interpreting feedback, I should pop into some of the questions we're getting from the audience, because I've got my own prepared questions about it, but actually some of them are already kind of going after some of the really sort of salient points here. Like, for instance, MozaTrack92 wants to know, how can you tell the difference between feedback you're getting that is noise and feedback that is actually useful? Like, once the survey comes back, and and you, for instance, you've asked a bunch of open-ended questions. How do you turn a lot of those answers from open-ended questions into usable data?
To be honest, a lot of that comes down to like me, right? If I get a survey back and I start seeing responses that feel like noise and that feel like they're not actionable feedback, then that immediately tells me, oh crap, I just asked the wrong questions. Now I'm just gonna need to like figure out how to make some lemonade out of this. Like honestly, like anytime we're getting answers to our questions in these surveys, like it's very rare to get things that are completely useless. And when they are, I think it's probably pretty obvious, because if you ever find yourself like writing your life story or complaining about things that are perhaps completely unrelated to the game, that's noise.
So actually, one thing that I'm curious about is like what is the volume typically of responses to our surveys, or like different kinds of surveys that we do? Like how much of this data are you trying to process and turn into something useful?
It can really vary. So on the high end of things, we ran a survey when Homecoming launched. That I think that was in the like version of the game that actually was showing up on everyone's Xboxes, PCs, even on their phones if they were playing on xCloud. Once they played for like 1 hour, I want to say. We got a lot of responses to that one. I think all told there was like 2,200 across all of the different platforms.
Wow.
On the smaller end of things, the PTR surveys are a little more manageable. The 2 times we ran experiments for the infestations, or the infestations experiments we ran, both of those we got around 50 responses.
Is 50 still representative enough that you consider that data to be useful?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would like more, but I'll take 50. And there might be questions where I start to dive into the data and I'm like, oh, well, difficulty again is a good example. In a perfect world, it would be great to have 50 of every people playing on every difficulty setting. And then I could say, okay, people on Green Zone think this is too easy, just about right, too hard. And instead what I'm doing is I'm taking 50 people who played on 5 different difficulty settings and being like, okay, so 10 people who played on lethal think this is blah, 7 people who played on Nightmare think this is blah. And it's like, we're kind of reading tea leaves here. So are there just trends across all of them that we can be talking about? Or are there like specific aspects of difficulty that we should be paying attention to instead?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So hearing just the sheer volume of the feedback doesn't actually tell you everything you need to know, because you have to subdivide the audience to get some of your most useful feedback, and then it can get really, really small and unrepresentative.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to be getting like 50 people as a reasonable starting point, because some percentage of those 50 people like something, some percentage of those 50 people don't like something, and we want to make sure that we've got enough of the people who like something to understand why they like it, enough people who didn't like it to understand why they didn't like it, right? And then we can be like, okay, are these the same thing? Because sometimes it'll literally be like, I love this, I hate this, and it's like, okay, well, is there clearly more of one group than the other? Or, designer, decide who you'd like to make happy here. Glad that's not my job. Um,
Yeah. I
yeah.
was gonna say, in terms of the question about noise, that's what I think of a lot. Is that there's a lot of contradictory feedback that comes up, where it's like one player's like, there's way too much of this one thing, and then another person's like, there is not enough of this, and then it's definitely the conflicting things. I think what we often tend to do is try to find when there's like a specific thing that a lot of people are saying, like, oh, multiple people are having problems with this certain thing, and it's coming up a lot. It's like, that's probably not noise. Then that's something we should pay attention to. When like 30% of the people are mentioning this one very specific thing, then it's probably something we should take note of.
Yeah. That actually leads me into a question asked by Lady X in the chat. She says, "Hi, Jonathan. How do you categorize comments? Do you just put them into negative and positive buckets, or would it be, like how do you transform, particularly like free response questions into data as you're sort of determining what they say and finding that 30% that all said the same thing? How do you do that?"
Yeah, so when I'm looking at like real, like open-ended text comments, usually I'm looking at those because I'm looking for a why. So either I might have run a survey where I asked people to provide some ratings for things, and I can be like, okay, the ratings for this feature for, about this question are this is good. The ratings about this tell me this is bad. Or sometimes I'm even just literally asking people like yes or no, is this good, is this bad? Usually in fancier sounding words than that.
Got to put that PhD to work.
Exactly. And so like when I'm doing my first pass through the data from a survey, I'll be like, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. This part is fun, this part is not fun. Here's an area, one of the goals where we're just completely blowing it, and here's a goal where we're on target. And then the next step is to go through the comments and be like, okay, I know this part is fun. Why is this part fun? I know this part is not fun. Why is it not fun? And so that's what I'm trying to get out of those comments at that point in time, is that why. And so honestly, I'll like just put a giant row of comments into a spreadsheet, or a giant column rather, not a row. And when it's a really big survey, like homecoming, I'm sorry, folks, I didn't read 2,200 comments for every question from the homecoming survey. Depending on the question, we'll go like, how many of these is enough that we think it'll tell us what we need to know? That number is usually around like 50 to 100. And so I might pull like 50 to 100 just comments, like pull them out randomly, more or less, to make sure I'm getting a representative sample and not just getting them from like one specific chunk in the middle of my raw data. And I'll just start going through those and do a process called coding, where I just like read a comment, come up with a way to just TLDR it for myself, right? And it'll be like, what's not fun? Camera sucks, camera sucks, camera sucks. What's fun? Driving's great, driving's great, driving's great.
So,
right.
So as you like notice trends, like you notice like, oh, I know I've seen this comment twice. Then you'll go and be like, okay, then I'll start putting the same, like basically coding these the same way. And as you find more of that comment, you'll code it the same way until you have an aggregate of like, oh, 19 people said this. And then
exactly.
You can run with that and treat it like almost like the same data you get from a multiple choice question.
Exactly. And that's how I figure out how prevalent these themes are. And because then I can get to the end of the section that I'm coding and be like, okay, out of 50 people, 30 people like the driving. I can or 30 people thought the best part was specifically driving, holding the door open, running over zombies. I may not have asked a question asking if that was good or not, but I can now tell the team, like, one of the things they really like about your game is holding the door open and running over zombies.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of the question about, whether we categorize it in negative or positive, I would say in the reports, it does kind of come down to that. I know when we actually go over, this might be jumping the gun a little bit on top, but when we go over the report with the user research team, like they do have it kind of broken down into like highlights and kind of lowlights, and like here's the the things that people really liked about this feature, and then here are the problems that came up. So it does kind of boil down to that essentially in the end, because especially for us, we definitely the problems are what we want to address, And so, like, the highlights are great. It's good to know that we're doing the job, but we're not going to change things because of those. Typically, we're like, okay, we can leave that be, and it's the lowlights, the problems that we really want to address.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we try and break it down like that in our reports, because it can help a team understand like what they're scoping when they're planning out what to do, right? If I were to just take a finding that's for a new expansion, be like, okay, here's everything people thought about infestations, right? And then just put that all in one section, then it can become really hard for a team to be like, wait, is this part good or bad? I can't quite tell. And so we just put a report where it's like, here, first half, good, highlights, this part's working, this part's landing, this part's landing. And then break out, here's the other section, bad, here are the lowlights, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working. And that helps put a team in a position to be like, okay, this is a bunch of stuff we can ignore now. If we have to pay attention to, it's because when we're fixing this stuff, make sure it doesn't ruin this stuff all over again.
Yeah, totally. Because that can completely happen. Because we've got all of these interconnected systems in this game, it's really easy for changes to have unanticipated consequences. And that's part of what we're trying to find when we go to the PTR, ask people how the game is doing. Part of what we're trying to find is the unintended consequences that the players are going to notice after weeks of play that we were not going to be able to just guess in advance.
Sometimes they're even intended. Like that happens time to time where like the team will be talking about changing something and changing a feature, and then I'll think of them like, well, actually, players talk about this specific aspect as a positive a lot, so we can't actually do anything to take, like, we got to be careful about that because players have specifically said that they like something, and so the different the team isn't privy to all the feedback, so there'll be certain things that the players talk about liking that a lot of the team isn't aware that players really like. So it's something that definitely I think that falls on me a lot, is to make sure we're like, okay, but the players have talked about this being a positive a lot, so we can't screw with that too much. We got to be careful about messing with that. So it does, a lot of times it is kind of intentional. It's just that we don't realize how much the players like it a lot.
So we're running a little bit on time, but I kind of wanted to make sure that we got into, once we've actually got the feedback and we've sort of, got a sense of, what the feedback is saying to us. How do we put that into action? Like Ehrich, like what is the process of, a survey has just come in, Jonathan's produced a report for it. How do you turn that into a plan of action for the team?
So it comes in a few phases. So the first thing is just kind of going over the report with Jonathan and the user research team. And so we kind of get the feature team together in a meeting, and he kind of runs us through the report and kind of breaks it down. And we get to ask any clarifying questions to make sure we actually kind of understand the problems that came up, and kind of maybe pitch some ideas of like what we think was happening. Because a lot of times, you have to interpret going from the feedback, to try to understand what the actual underlying problems are. Because sometimes you'll be looking at symptoms and you have to take a step back and kind of theorize what the actual problems were that were causing that symptoms. So we'll kind of do a meeting to kind of go over that stuff, so we kind of have a good idea of what the problems were that came up. And then we'll basically kind of then I mean, this is something that's kind of always in iteration. We're always working on how this process works. But offline, we'll kind of break those like individual problems up into kind of their own specific topics. And we'll talk about those kind of offline asynchronously. And then we'll eventually get together to have meetings to talk about any given topic. And then say, okay, now this problem, we've talked about it kind of offline asynchronously. Let's kind of go over the different the solutions that were proposed offline, and kind of try to figure out which ones we think are doable, which ones we think would solve it the best. And then it's just tasking it out essentially, and says, okay, so we think we got a good solution for this one. Let's make the tasks for it and get that done. I mean, and that's basically how it goes. It's just trying to get the team involved in helping to kind of brainstorm solutions to the problems. But it's always something we're kind of constantly working on and trying to improve the process there. And a big part of that is also then making sure we actually close the loop, I think.
Oh yeah.
Afterwards, after. Oh yeah. I mean,
sorry.
again,
I was
this may be jumping the
excited
gun,
you were going to talk about this, so go for it.
Yeah, because then we'll address it. And And a lot of times then after, the part of the process is, we'll brainstorm solutions. We'll discuss what we think the best solution is. We'll actually task it out. We'll implement it. And then we'll do internal play tests kind of then to try to get a little more, be like, okay, did that feel like it worked? Depending on how much time we have. Like a lot of times, after you've done a round of like PTR feedback and then you've done all the work to kind of address the problems, there's not a time to do another PTR push necessarily. And so then we'll resort to internal playtest to kind of see if that felt like it really solved the problem. And then after that, it's, closing the loop is a big part of that, is actually making sure we tell the audience, here are the problems we were looking at addressing, and here's how we address them. So they understand what the changes are and why they were made. And that goes for the internal playtest too. That's such an important thing to do, and it's really easy to forget to do that. I think teams have done that. It's very, very, very common, and every studio I've been at has been really bad about closing the loop, but it's such an important part of the process, and it makes the people who are participating in the playtests really feel like their voice is being heard, because it is, but they have to know that it is being heard. So they, reiterating, like for us, when we do internal playtest, after we kind of like figure out what we're going to do, we in our playtest channel we'll be like, okay, here are the things that came up and here's what we're going to do to address them. And then for like a live release, we will, it goes into the patch notes. We're like, okay, so we've made these round of changes. These are the problems that came up from the PTR, and then this is how we address them to make sure that the players know how we're addressing things.
Yeah, I think one of the one common experience I have with like interacting with players like on social media and stuff like that is they'll say, "When are you going to fix this bug?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I don't know." And I'll go and I'll make it, go to our Slack channel where we make live reports, and I'll be like, "Hey, a player just asked me when are we going to fix this bug?" And someone will be like, "We did fix it like 3 updates ago." But the player, their experience with the bug happened months ago. And as far as they know, it never got fixed. And so they haven't had that experience again, but they've been playing, like anticipating that they might at any time because they thought it wasn't fixed. And so getting back to them and letting them know what we actually fixed is a really important part of the process.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time. We did not get to nearly as many questions as we hoped to. Thank you so much to all of you in the audience who have been asking questions. I tried to get to as many of them as I could. I was barely able to get to half of them. But we really appreciate your involvement. And you know what? This is all about trying to listen to your feedback. So that's why I'm especially sorry we didn't get to all of your questions today. But if you do have, if you want to, continue this chat with us, of course you can always find, me on social media. I'm at Rangatang on Twitter. You can send me questions. I can pass them on to people if you want to. We put the social media accounts for like me and Joe Smorner and Brant Fitzgerald in the description below if you're watching this later on YouTube or on Twitch. Yeah, I think, you know what? I'm going to stop playing the game right now. Oh no, there's a zombie trying to get me out of here. I better quickly switch my view so I can pause the game and you guys don't know that I'm sort of hopping out of it. But yeah, so this was really great. Thank you both for coming in here and chatting with us about this stuff. Jonathan, real quick, because you brought this up, very early on in the process, I wonder if you wanted to just quickly remind people what they can do to get involved in Xbox research later on down the line.
Oh yeah, there's a link right above my head. I'm told that moderators have given you this link in chat, or will again maybe give you this link in chat. And if you're watching this as a VOD later on, that should be somewhere in the show notes. Eventually you'll be able to go to this link and sign up to be recruited to take part in UR studies. If you're in the Seattle area, maybe someday in a physical lab, and otherwise over Discord, over Skype, over various virtual methods, where you can play different Xbox games that are in development and help give feedback on them that'll make all of the games better for everyone.
Yeah, and also you can always go, if you have an issue with the game or feedback that you want to give us, you can always go to support.stateofdecay.com. There's a place there where you can make reports about bugs. There's also a wish list where you can make suggestions about features that you'd like to see. We do pay attention to that, and so we'd really love to get your feedback any way that we can. Thank you so much for coming in, Jonathan. We really love to have you here, and we should have you back sometime in the future to get even deeper into some of these topics. Maybe the next time we've got an excuse.
I think there's a lot we could talk about on this. Obviously, we didn't get to half of this stuff.
Yeah. So we
well.
over prepared a little bit, just because we wanted to make sure we had enough to talk about, but we had way more than we thought. So Ehrich, thank you for coming in here and answering the questions about implementation. Again, we're going to have you back too to talk about a lot of this stuff in the future.
Certainly. Anytime.
Awesome. Well, with that, I guess we'll wrap things up. So our next stream is going to be a Father's Day stream hosted by Joe Swarner. It also happens to be the anniversary of Heartland's release a few years ago. So we might be talking about Heartland, checking that out. And Heartland is, it's got a story that's about daddy issues. And so it seems like it's you know, a perfect match for Father's Day. So that's what we'll be doing soon. We hope you come back for that. And with that, I guess we'll get out of here. We're going to put, you know, if you're watching this later on YouTube, of course, we're going to stick a subscribe button on this screen and some links to other videos. So you can stick with us. We would love to have you here back as often as you'd like to come. And now we have to sit here for 20 seconds while the YouTube video finishes. And it's weird.
Awkward.